Hey, what's up? My name is Ari. I'm a product designer based in Sydney, Australia, and in this video, we're going to talk about Figma. We're going to start with the absolute basics of Figma, and then we're going to work our way into creating a fairly easy but cool looking design just to get you guys started on your journey. Everything is timestamped as usual down below, so feel free to jump into a chapter that's most relevant to you. With that out of the way, let's get into it. Now, before we get started, let's talk about tools. There are many different tools out there for UI designers, things like Sketch, Figma, Adobe XD, Framer, and a couple of more. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter which one you choose in order to get the job done. They all do the same thing, but excel in a different area. For example, if I want better performance out of my tool, I'd probably lean into Sketch. If I'm working on a larger project and I need a lot of collaboration and I need like a good end-to-end ecosystem, I'd go for something like Figma. If I need complex animations, I'd probably lean towards something like Framer. And if I need to stay within the Adobe ecosystem, I'd probably go for something like Adobe XD. At the end of the day, all that matters is your own preference, the company you work for, and the type of a project that you're working on. I personally switched from Sketch to Figma back in 2017 for the following reasons. It has a great ecosystem, it has a great end-to-end tooling, it's good enough to do simple prototypes and animations on it and to do user testings that way. The developer handover experience is really good, the component library and the library management side of things is amazing. It's great for larger projects and larger design systems. It has a great file management experience. It's online, which makes sharing and collaborating with other designers and stakeholders much easier. Alrighty, this right here is what we're going to be designing today. It's a very simple login and registration page. It doesn't necessarily have all the best UI or UX practices, but it does the job to explain and teach most things you need to know as a beginner and even some more advanced topics of Figma. And that's what we're going to be covering today. You basically come over here, you have this simple create an account page, and I could click on sign in and it's going to take me to a sign in page. So we're going to be designing this entire thing, and we're also going to put this super simple prototype together as well, where you can actually click to go to the next or the previous page. Let's get going. To get started, you first need to download Figma, and that's quite easy. Just go to figma.com. First, you need to sign up for an account if you haven't got one yet. And once you're done, you could either use their web app, but I do suggest that if you can, just get their desktop app. And you could simply do that by going to their footer, going to resources, downloads, and download the app for either macOS or Windows. However, if you are going to use this on the web, I do suggest that you also get their font installers, as this allows you to use your local font on their web app. I'm going to be using a font called Inter. You could download it from here, which is the Google font. But I believe that if you just download Figma, it'll come out of a box within Figma, so you might not actually need to download it. But in case you do, that's where it is. Again, I will link to this down below as well. The last thing that we'll need is the illustration. So I got my illustration from Icons 8. So you just go to illustrations. I used Sammy over here. So again, link to the illustrations also down below. But basically just need to go over here. You just need to download the PNG. That's basically what we're going to be using for this example. So you don't really have to pay for a subscription or anything. But it's a great website, and I do definitely recommend using them in your future projects if it comes in handy for you guys. By the way, the link to everything that I'm talking about right now will be down in the description if you want to access them at any time, right below the like button. Like and subscribe. Once you open Figma, your Figma file might look slightly different to mine, but that doesn't really matter. Just press Command N or Control N on your keyboard, open up a new design file. There we go, just like that. And now we're ready to go through the basics of the Figma UI. Before we get started with the actual project, let's just get some Figma basics out of the way by explaining the Figma UI. But don't worry if you don't really understand everything straight away, as we're going to come back to most of these later on throughout the project. So, the Figma UI. The way that I like to think about it is that you've got the left-hand side, which is basically all of your navigations and organization. So you've got the layers, you've got assets, and you've got pages. We'll get to all of these later. At the top, we have the tools. We have Figma preferences. We'll get to some of these later. We've got your file name and file location. So you could rename your file over here. You could even access some options down here. We probably won't get to most of these in this session, but maybe later on. And on the right hand side at the top, you have your typical zoom. So you could zoom in, zoom out. You could showcase some stuff on the UI. You could play your prototype, and you could share this guy with your collaborators or your stakeholders, or even publish to the community. On the right hand side is what I would like to call the control and edit. And basically everything over here changes based on what you're interacting with on the screen. So I'll give you an example. I'm just going to very quickly draw a rectangle over here. And you can see that whilst the rectangle is active, the UI on the right hand side changes to indicate what I can and cannot do with that rectangle. You also have your prototyping capabilities and your inspect capabilities that we'll get to later as well. But at a very high level, the design is everything that you interact and manipulate this shape with. The prototype is, well, self-explanatory. You create a prototype and you control and interact with that. And then you've got your inspect. This is basically most people with a view-only account would see on your Figma. What's a view-only account? It's basically when you share your Figma file with a stakeholder or a developer where they can actually just come over here, get the properties of this specific shape, things like its width, its height, its colors. You could even set the type of the color that you want to share with developers. And in some cases, even the code, although the code is not always the best code that you could potentially apply in the real world, it does give you some things like, for example, the name of the object and some other stuff that can be actually very useful for the developer. And you could even change it to a different language like the iOS or Android, but we're going to leave it at CSS for this one. You could also see that when I select something, some stuff at the top over here changes. We get ourselves the edit. That means that I can come here and directly edit my rectangle. We get component creation, and we get this other thing, which is for masking. And we'll get to some of these later as well. So that's the basics. Now let's go ahead and break each of these down further as well. Let's start with layers. So what are layers for? It's basically for organizing your content. So let's go ahead and create a few different shapes over here. I'm going to create a rectangle. I'm also going to create an ellipse or a circle. And I'm also going to create a triangle, which it's called a polygon in Figma. The reason why it's called a polygon and not a triangle is that you can actually manipulate the number of sides that it has and create different shapes out of it. But we are going to leave it like this. So you can see that every time I bring something new in here, it gets placed at the bottom of the layers hierarchy. Now, in order to explain the next bit, I'm going to change the color of these things. So as we talked about before, every time you select anything within the main frame over here, you can manipulate a bunch of properties about it. So I'm going to change the color of each of these shapes. I'm going to change the rectangle to red. I'm going to change my circle to green, and I'm going to change my triangle to blue. The order that you would have your things under the layer actually matters. It basically represents where they are placed on the z-axis. Z-axis meaning that if the rectangle is at the bottom, it means that the rectangle is at the bottom of both of these shapes, meaning that if I was to drag this over here, you can see that it's below the circle and it's also below the rectangle. The rectangle is obviously the first item within my layer, so which means that it would be on top of both of these shapes. Now I could very simply just move them up and down to place them on top of each other and manipulate where they are placed on my frame. Now, another concept that I want you guys to understand is the concept of frames. In order to create a frame on Figma, you either click on this frame tool over here, or you simply press F on your keyboard, and you can click and drag in order to create a frame, or I'm just going to press F again. You can see that there's a whole bunch of preset frame sizes from this side that you could just use as well. I'm going to use a pre-sized frame, so a 1440 by 1024. I am going to change the height of a frame to 1080. And now I have a frame. Now you can think of this frame in multiple ways. One way to think about a frame is a single page of your website. So for example, this frame could be my homepage. And if I was to duplicate this frame, which I'm just going to go with copy, click out of it, paste, I'm going to rename them by double clicking onto the name up here. I'm going to change this to homepage, and I'm going to change this to about page. And you could think of these two frames as two separate pages on your website now. You could also see that they are represented with a different icon on my layers panel. And just like the shapes, the way that you place them determines the way that they are represented on this main frame over here. Now, at the moment, these shapes over here are not necessarily on any of these frames, and you can see that because they are detached from it. So I'm going to do a couple of things over here. I'm going to select my circle and I'm going to drag it into my frame. Notice what happens. You can see that it actually gets clipped and I get this blue border indicating that it's within my frame right now. And the other thing that happened is that it moved from the outer level of the layers inside my homepage. And now it's within here. And I'm going to do the same with my rectangle. I'm going to pull it right inside here. And you can see that the idea of a layer is still standing. However, it's now happening inside the frame. I'm going to delete about for now, and I'm just going to keep my homepage at the moment. The other thing that I want to explain to you guys is the ability to rename items within Figma. And it's always a good idea to name your different layers within Figma in order to keep them organized. As for bigger projects, if you leave things unnamed, it can actually get really, really messy as you go through them. In order to rename within Figma, you basically click on an element. You can either double click on its name over here in the layers panel and change it to, for example, circle, or you could click on an element and on your keyboard, you could go Command R or Control R in order to activate the renaming and then rename it to, for example, triangle. And now that's indicated over here. Now, renaming is also very useful when it comes to prototyping as well, but we'll get to that a little bit later. The next thing that I want to talk about are pages, and pages basically creates a really, really good way for us to organize our file structure. The way that you would modify your pages is really dependent on the project that you're working on, and every single different project might require a different page layout. I'll give you an example just to kind of like showcase one of its use cases. Sometimes I create different pages in order to organize multiple files. My first page is going to be my title page, and I'm going to move that up here, and I might just include the name of my file over here. So I could say something like sign up and sign in form. Make that big. I could even like change the color of this page if I wanted to. And once I'm done, you could very easily rename pages exactly how you would rename your layers. So over here, this could be my main frame 1. You might even want to do something like do all of your desktop versions over here, do all of your mobiles on the next page, so on and so forth. So that's one use case, but there are many other ways to rename and organize your files. And that's usually done through the pages. And you can see that I could very easily just jump between the pages by just clicking over here. The last thing that you want to familiarize yourself with on the left-hand side is this assets area or folder. In Figma, there is this idea of creating a component and being able to reuse that component, and I'll just demonstrate what that means. I'm going to go a little bit quickly here, but we'll explain these later on. So I'm just going to very quickly create a button. So another way that I usually organize my files is that I create a new page called components, and I place all of my components within this page. So go components. So I just very quickly created a button, and let me just paste that into my components folder. And the way that a component might work is you have this button component over here. It's a base component. We could even rename it to that. Button base. And you can turn these into components within Figma by a single click on this component item over here. And within Figma, there are multiple ways of creating different types of components, but one way to do that is to come over here and copy that base component, call this one button primary, and let's just call the second variant of this button critical. And let's go ahead and change some characteristics about them, right? So we're going to change the button primary color to, let's just go with this color over here. And our button critical, we're going to give it this color over here. And then we could recreate another component out of each of these two guys. And we could even combine them as a variant. Again, I'm going to explain all of these a little bit further. I'm just trying to demonstrate what this is for. And once we do that, you can now see that within my variant, I have a critical and a primary button. And if I wanted to go back to my desktop and I just want to grab that button that I just created, just basically drop it over here, I can go ahead and manipulate this button. So I could change it to click here, or I could go don't click here. And I could change the properties of this because I created the primary. This is the primary button. And I could very simply change this to a critical button. There we go. Now, the good thing about components is that if anything happens in the future and I wanted to change something about these components, let's say that I wanted to change my fonts, I could very simply just go over here and just go, all right, now we're going to use the Times fonts. And you can see that by simply just changing the font within here, all of these buttons just change their fonts automatically. I could even take this further and potentially change the base color to FFF, like a white color, and all of my buttons are now taking that characteristics. You could see that implementing components this way, you could save so much time later down the road as your project gets bigger and you have to make changes here and there. And it just makes making changes extremely effortless in a way. But also on top of that, it'll help you create a more consistent look and feel across your entire design. Okay, I'm going to delete these. I'm going to delete my components as well, and going to delete the mobile page because we're not going to be working with that. And let's move on. Now that we're done with this left section, let's explain the top section over here. I'm going to also delete my frame. As I said before, this is our file name. This is our global file name. I could click on it and I could change that. And I'm going to do that right now. I'm going to change it to login and sign up. The next thing we're going to do, we're going to talk about these tools over here. This is basically all of your Figma preferences and options and plugins. You can access all of those global Figma elements from here. We're not really going to be playing around with this in this tutorial. It's a little bit out of scope, but maybe in a future tutorial. But the main tools that you'll be using most of the times are these guys over here. This is a selector or the move tool. And you could activate this by simply pressing V on your keyboard or just clicking the actual tool up here. There's also a scale tool, which we'll get to maybe in a different tutorial. The whole idea with this is that I could come over here and I could select items, I can move things around, and you'll be using this a lot. So it's really good to get used to the idea of pressing V on your keyboard every time you want to get to this for a very quick access. The next thing we're going to talk about is the shape tool, which is this guy over here. So as we talked about, there are all of these shapes over here that you could use out of a box. There's also images. We'll get to that a little bit later. For me, for the most part, for about 80% of the times, I only use a rectangle tool. To activate the rectangle tool, you could either click on rectangle, or you could simply press R on your keyboard, and you could just drag and draw a rectangle on the page like this. You could see that on the right-hand side, I get all of these different options. I could manipulate its width if I wanted to. So I could make this 1000 in width and maybe, I don't know, 350 in height. I could change its angle to a 15-degree angle. I could change the corner radius over here as well by either selecting and dragging these circles around, or I could get a more precise action by just selecting and this box over here and pressing a number. If I wanted to manipulate these individually, I could either click the edit over here, and this will allow me to select individual corners. And I'm holding shift right now to hold the second corner, and I could manipulate these individually like that. So maybe bring the number up to like 72 if I needed to for my design. I'm just gonna zero out the angle just so that this is a little bit easier to see. Or I could click on independent corners. And the way that this works is basically the same as CSS. It usually goes left-hand side, right-hand side, left-hand side, right-hand side, bottom. So like if I change this to 24, that's the top left. This will be the top right. This will be the bottom right, and this will be the bottom left. So you can see that I could modify these individually as well. But for the most part, as I said, I always use the rectangle tool because I can be a little bit more flexible with the stuff that I create. So for example, if I wanted to create a square over here, but from this square, I could basically modify it to get a circle by adding corner radius to it. I could make that less of a circle if you like. I could even create triangles out of this. So like I could very simply draw a rectangle, rotate it at 45, and I could modify it by deleting one of the points, and I could just grab the pen tool, which is the next thing that we're going to talk about, to make this into a rectangle, give it a fill, and then all of a sudden we have our rectangle over here. So the next thing is a pen tool. The idea of a pen tool or the pencil tool is for you to draw customized vector shapes, and you could create whatever and give it a fill or give it a stroke. And that way you could draw custom shapes. Next is text or typography. The keyboard shortcut for typography is T on your keyboard. You could just click the tool up here and then click anywhere that you want to type and start typing away. You can modify your text from the right hand side. You could change its color. You could add stroke to it, or anything else that you really want to do to your text can be found on the right hand side over here. This basically represents the font size. So if I was to change this, we could get a smaller font. This is the line height. This is letter spacing. So if you wanted further spacing between your letters, you could increase that. You could even change its units to be in pixels by simply typing that in. This is paragraph spacing. This right here basically allows you to modify the way that your text works. So for example, if you wanted to give this a fixed width, you could simply click this, and now this has a fixed width. So it means that as I type, this is just going to go further down the page. If I give it the other height, then as I type, as you can see, the height of the bounding box grows with the text as I type the text in. I could change the width and the height of this box if I wanted to. So I could increase the width, for example, and that will basically allow for the text to move around. And that's basically text at a very high level. The next thing is the pan tool. So the pan tool also works by you just holding down space on your keyboard and clicking and dragging anywhere, and this is good to move around the screen. And the last thing is the comments. So basically you could click over here, you could type a comment on your designs, you could even at someone. This will alert them that I'm typing to them. Once you press post, they'll receive a message letting them know that there is a comment waiting for them. The only thing that I usually change on my preference that I just want to showcase to you guys is the nudge amount. I usually change it to 8 because I work with the units of 8, but basically what that means is if I was to draw a rectangle by pressing R on my keyboard and drawing a rectangle, I could move this rectangle around by pressing on my arrow keys on my keyboard, and I could move this rectangle around by the nudge amount pixel. Like for example, the nudge amount by default is 10, but I change it to 8. So if it's at 8, that means that if I hold down shift and press right, left, down, or up, this will move around by 8 pixels rather than 10 pixels. And this will just make my life so much easier since I work with the units of 8. We talked about these are just basically all around creating components and modifying your shape as you need to. On the right hand side, we have the avatar of the active users on this file. At the moment it's just me, but if you have more people, you can see their avatars up here. Then you have the share. This is basically a way for you to share your files with different people, and you have full control over who can and cannot access your files. So you could just go can view, you could type their email in, you could type their name in, you could just say anyone can view this link and just copy the link and send it to anyone. You could link down to a specific frame. So if I had multiple frames over here, like frame 1 and frame 2, and if I was to click on this and press share, you can see that I could link to this very specific frame. So that means that once the person opens this up, it's just going to zoom in straight to this frame over here. The last two things are prototype. So once we build a prototype, I'll show you guys how that works, but that will just take you to a presentation mode for your prototype. And the final thing is the zoom. You could basically zoom in or zoom out by just pressing plus or minus on your keyboard. And that's very easy to do. So I always just use the plus or minus. You could also just zoom into the 100%, so how everything would be seen. The keyboard shortcut for that is Shift 0, and you could go Shift 1, which would just basically fit whatever you have within your field of view. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete these, and now we are ready to start the actual project. All right, let's get started with the actual project. Let's go ahead and start a new Figma file by pressing either Control or Command N, select a new design file, wait for it to load, and we're good to go. I'm going to call this login and sign up. And we're ready. The way that we're going to set this up is we're going to select our frame. You could either use this at the top. I'm just going to press F on my keyboard. I'm going to use a preset, so 1440 by 1024. I'm going to change the 1024 to 1080, and I'm going to rename this to sign up, and that's what we're going to start with. And we're going to be on our page 1. I'm just going to name this one to main, leave it like that, and we're good to go basically from here. The Figma has this thing which are rulers. We could bring them in to create our own guides, and you could do these individually to basically create this thing in design that's called a grid system, but an easier way to do that, and let me just get rid of all of these by pressing Command Z or Control Z if you're on Windows. I'm going to get rid of my rulers by pressing Shift R on my keyboard. That gets rid of the rulers just so that we could clean up some real estate over here. And from here, I'm going to create a grid system. So how do we do that? I'm just going to click on my sign up frame, go to Layout Grid, and press on this plus key over here, and that creates a grid. But this is not the type of a grid that I'm after. I'm not really after a grid. I'm after a column grid, really. So I'm going to press on the drop down, select columns. I'm going to create a 12 column grid. And for this particular project, the way that I'm going to set my grids up is I'm going to align them to the center. They're not going to be stretched. They're going to have a width of 80 pixels individually. So each of these red items are 80 pixels, and my gutter is going to be 24 pixels, and we're good to go. Now, Figma has this thing that are basically tokens. If I wanted to recreate this same grid on another frame that I create, so if I was to create another frame over here, and let's just say it's another desktop frame, and it's at 1080, exactly like the previous one. Oops, I don't think if I changed this one. No, I did. Just reset it. Instead of just going over here and recreating that grid, I could very simply just save this grid as a token. So the way that you would do that is, you see this style over here, it's going to be a style token. I'm going to click on this. You can see that there is this create style at the top, and I'm just going to call this grid / desktop, and my grid is created. So if I was to come to my new frame, instead of me creating a grid from scratch, I could very simply click on the style and select my desktop grid. The way that / works, when I type in / something, so you notice that I typed in grid and then I typed in / and then desktop, and what that does is it creates this subcategory and it allows me to place and organize my style tokens accordingly. You can actually see my global styles available as well. So my grid styles over here, it's the one that I just created, and that's when I have nothing selected. You could see it over here. If later in the future I wanted to change anything about this grid, it's available within my global system right now. So if I was just to click on the grid, select desktop, and I could edit basically anything about it, including its name. But I could just click on the grid, I could change it to 90, and you can see that my grid everywhere changes if you change any of these properties. And again, it just makes your life so much easier as your project grows. You can show or hide these grids by simply pressing Ctrl G on your keyboard, which you can see that it hides and shows the grid layouts. Or you could come over here, go to view, and there is layout grids. And if you press that shows up. But I just use a keyboard shortcut because that's just much faster than that. So I'm going to hide them for now as we don't really need them. You'll see why they come in handy later. It's just going to allow us to create this very clean layout and just keep everything again like very, very organized. So if I wanted to change the background color of this from white to anything else, I would simply click on my frame. You can see that we've got a fill over here. That's technically our background color. And when I click on this, you can see that I've got all of these different options over here. The color that I use is FF1DC, hex value. If you don't have hex, you could just simply select hex from here. We're going to work with hex. Now we're going to be reusing this color. So again, anything that you reuse, you want to create a token out of so you could reuse over and over again without having to repeat yourself. How do we create a color token? It's very similar to the grid token. Next to the fill, you simply click on the style dropdown, you go create a new style, and we're going to follow the exact same pattern. The way that you would name these depends on your project. The way that I'm going to set this up, this cream is going to be a part of my secondary palette. So I'm going to type in secondary / cream. So then the cream is the name of a color. The secondary is the category I'm going to place this color within. And as we talked about, the slash basically separates them into their own category. If I click on create style, you can see that this is now secondary cream. And if I go to my global styles, you can see that I got secondary and cream is right under there. Perfect. Next thing we're going to build is our logo. And the way that I'm going to do that is with a rectangle. I'm just going to zoom in over here. The dimensions of my logo is made up of 3 separate circles, and I'm going to create my circles with a square. For the benefits that I mentioned before, I can basically manipulate it or change the shape if I wanted to later down the road without too much hassle or trouble. So the first square that I'm going to create that's going to be placed at the back of my shape is 88 by 88. So I'm going to press R on my keyboard for the rectangle tool, and I'm going to click and drag in order to create my square. You can see that as I drag around, it's very difficult to create a 88 by 88 88 square. As you can see that this is basically just freeform resizing itself. So in order to lock the ratio, I can hold down Shift as I'm dragging, and you can see that no matter where I move my mouse, the ratio is now locked to be a 1:1. So I could basically modify it to be at around the 88:88, and I'm going to stop right here. And I'm going to increase the corner radius by holding down Shift and pressing up on my keyboard in order to increase that number until I get a perfect circle, exactly like this. And this is my outer square. The next two shapes are going to be rectangle shapes as well, but we're going to modify their border radius to make them into a circle. So in order to do that quickly, I'm just going to copy this shape twice. So you could either go Command C, Command V, and you can see that it just pasted another shape on top of my shape, and I could just drag that to the side. Or I could simply hold down Alt on my keyboard and click and drag, and that creates another shape for me. The biggest circle shape is going to be placed at the bottom, so I'm going to call this the back plate, I'm going to call this the middle plate, and I'm going to call this the top plate. The top plate is going to be 40:40. Instead of resizing this through here, I'm going to resize it using the control boxes over here. So I'm going to change this to 40. Make sure your constraint proportions is on in order to lock in the proportions. If I don't do that, and if I change this, you're only going to be changing one side of your rectangle and not both sides, and you might get a weird shape. So I'm going to press Command Z to undo that. Make sure that that's locked. Change it down to 40 for the smallest circle. For my middle circle, I'm going to be going with 64:64. The next thing I'm going to do is to give this guy my primary red. In order to do that, I'm going to select all three of these guys, come to the fill, and my primary red is F9 4F46. And I'm going to create a token out of this color as well. This one's going to be primary and red. Create the style, perfect. And the next thing that I'm going to do is to change the opacity in order to create a cool-ish effect. So I'm going to change the opacity of the first circle to 20%. I'm going to change the opacity of the second circle to 40%. And I'm going to leave this one at 100%. And then I'm going to select all of my circles, and I'm going to use the alignment tools at the top. I'm going to align horizontally to center. So that basically plays all of my circles to the center. And then I'm going to vertical align them to the center as well. And you can see that all of a sudden we have our logo. On Figma, you can group items that belong together by simply selecting all of them, right-clicking, just clicking on group selection, and now you have an entire group. You can see that when I select a group, I can move the whole thing around, or you could open a group up and still manipulate each of these individually. And in order to ungroup things, you could simply right-click, click on ungroup, and it's just going to ungroup everything back to how they were before. A faster way to do this is to select everything and just go Command and Control G, and you've grouped everything together just like this, and Command Shift G or Control Shift G will ungroup them for you. I'm going to rename my group to logo, and I'm going to place it in the center of my frame. How am I going to do that? Well, I could either just drag it around until the guide comes up that I'm right in the center. You can see that the guides come up as I'm moving this guy around. But an easier way to do that is if I have an item within the frame, when I move this item around with the alignment tools, it's going to align this item based on my frame, right? So if I align to the left, it's going to go to the left. If I go align to the center, it's going to go to the center. So I'm going to place it over here, and I want it to be exactly 32 pixels from the top. On Figma, in order to get these measurements showing on your frames, you could simply hold down Alt or Option on your keyboard, and it's just going to showcase these measurements for you. And if I let go of Alt or Option, I could simply toggle the numbers on and off. Now, I'm going to show them, and I'm going to move my item with my keys instead of the mouse in order to make this easier to move around. So I'm going to use my up arrow keys in order to just move it up to 32 pixels. Yep, I'm pretty happy with this. Just like that, we've got our logo. A good rule of thumb within Figma, and we've talked about this over and over again, is to try and create everything into tokens or components if they're going to be reused later. And I know that my logo will be reused all around the app, so I'm going to make this into a component. Now, how do you make something into a component? Well, you simply select it, make sure you've named it correctly. You can come up over here and just create a component out of it. And just like that, this logo is now a component. One thing to do, which would be a good idea, is to create a new page and place all of your components in a page called components. And you could basically create a frame, as we talked about this before. And I'm going to rename this one to branding materials, and I'm going to cut my logo from here by pressing Command or Control X, and I'm going to paste it over here by pressing Command or Control V. This is now basically my logo component. This is the master component, and if I change this, all the other variants of this would also change. So I'm going to go back to my page one. I'm going to rename this page as well actually to something like main. And I'm going to go to my assets and search for logo. And you can see that my logo now appears over here. I'm going to drag and drop it over here, and I'm going to center it to the page. Make sure that I am 32 pixels from the top. And just like that, we got our logo going. All right, up next is going to be our typography. I'm going to go back to layers, and I'm going to press T on my keyboard for text. Type anything over here is going to write something. And I'm going to type in sign up because this is my sign up page. And I'm also going to modify this text. The sign up is basically my tagline, and I want a consistent look and feel for all of my tagline texts. So what I'll do, I'll basically select it, and I'm going to change my font to Inter. I'm going to change its font weight to bold. Font size is going to be 14 pixels, and line height is going to be 16 pixels. The color of my tagline is going to be the primary color as well. The last thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to click on these three dots over here, which are the type details, and I'm going to change the case to be uppercase at all times. I'm pretty happy with this. I know that I'm going to use my tagline later again. So what I'll do, I'll create a token out of this, select it. I'll go to my text styles, create a new style, call this one tagline default. There we go. We got our tagline. You can now see that I've got text styles, I've got color styles, and they're all basically right over here for me, and I could change them as I need to. Next thing we're going to add is our heading 1. Again, press T on my keyboard, start typing heading 1. By default, because I had tagline selected previously, it's going to showcase tagline for me, but I'm going to just basically detach the style, and we're going to create this one from scratch. So this one over here, the first thing that I'm going to do is to take away the case styling. So it's going to go back to a normal style. I'm going to leave the font weight as bold, but what I'll do, I'll change the font size to 40 and the line height to 48. With my tagline, actually, I'm also going to make sure that it's text aligned to the center, and I'm going to make sure that this is also text aligned to the center. Now that I'm happy with this, I'm going to add this to my styles as heading 1, and I'm just going to rename this to create an account. And I'm going to color this to a custom black that I want to add to my color palette. The hex code for my custom black is 2D0200. And I'm going to add this to my palette. I'm going to call it neutral/black. And you can see that we now have neutral black over here, and this is now a token. Next thing I'm going to do is to make sure that this is exactly 8 pixels from the tagline. So you know how that works. You select it and you hover over the tagline with your option key pressed down, and you can just move it up until you get to an 8 pixel gap between the two. Then I'm going to add my paragraph. So paragraph is easy. We just, again, basically repeat the same theme, but for paragraph. So I'm going to press T on my keyboard. This is going to be my paragraph text. And again, I'm going to detach the style so I could change it up. This time I'm going to select regular for my font weight. I'm going to use the font size 16, line height as 24. And again, we're going to introduce a new color. And this one is going to be 807260. And I'm going to add it to my neutral palette as gray 800. Although this isn't great, this is just a convention that I like to use. We'll explain design systems and how you come up with these naming conventions in future videos. But for now, let's just go with this just to keep this simple. You can see that underneath my colors, because I've been using the neutral naming convention, you can see that my black is on top now and we got gray 800 at the bottom, and they're both under the neutral palettes. For the text itself, I'm going to change this to body/1. Next, we're just going to type "Welcome to Onyx, where magic happens." And I'm also going to make sure that this is exactly 8 pixels from my main heading 1. And I'm also going to select everything and make sure that they're all aligned to the center of each other. I'm also just going to make sure that they're aligned to the center of the frame by pressing Command G to group everything into one group. I'm just going to make sure that my group is aligned to the center. And I'm just going to press Command Shift G to ungroup everything, and we are good to go. Next, we're going to draw a break line. In order to draw draw a line on Figma, you could use a line tool and you could simply just draw a line. And if I hold down Shift, it's going to draw a straight line. But the way that I like to, again, draw my lines is to use a rectangle tool. Again, that's just because it gives me more control over exactly how I want the line to look and its thickness. And there are a bunch of other stuff that we won't get into in this video, but I generally like to use a rectangle tool, but feel free to use a line tool if you need to. My line is going to be 1 pixel in thickness, so I'm going to give it a 1 pixel thickness, and my line is going to be 392 pixels in width. The color of the line is going to be F0E9DE, and it's this very light kind of creamy color. We're going to add that to our neutral palette as well. Neutral gray, let's just go with 400 for now. We could probably change that later if we need to. The line is going to be exactly 24 pixels from my body one. Next, we're going to create our form inputs and labels. Now that's going to be a repeated process. So this is where we're going to tackle some of the more complex items of Figma. Creating labels is easy. So let's just go ahead and get the label going. So I'm just going to press T on my keyboard, type in label for now, and I'm going to modify my text. It's going to be 14 pixels. It's going to be 24 in height, but it's going to be medium in font weight. And I'm going to add that to my text tokens. I'm going to call it maybe tag label. We could change that later if you want to. For now, we're going to make it tag label. I'm going to make sure that it's left aligned, and I'm going to give it the same color as my black. And the next thing that I'm going to add is my input field. So an input field can be a text field, email field, password field, basically anything like that. I'm simply going to create one by pressing R on my keyboard to enable the rectangle tool. I'm just going to drag it for now, but I'm going to come over here and change the height to 48. I'm going to change the border radius 4 pixels. And I'm going to change the background color to a new color that we haven't used before, which is F7F4EE. And I'm going to add this to our tokens by calling it neutral gray 200. So you can see the pattern is that the lower the number is, the lighter the color is as well. And I know that I'm going to need another color. I'm just going to add that right now. It's just going to be a simple white color. And we're going to make this one neutral white. I think our neutral palette is basically done. Cool. I'm gonna get rid of this box because we don't really need it right now. Now it's time for the final part, which are the Figma auto layouts. Now, what is an auto layout? In its most basic form, it's basically a dynamic Figma layout that allows you to create designs that shrinks and grows as you need them to. What does that mean? Well, the easiest way to explain this is to go ahead and design something with it. We're gonna start very, very simple, and then we're gonna slowly expand upon it. Let's start with the top section over here. What I want to do is to create an equal spacing between all of these three options over here. So for example, I want the distance between my sign up tagline to my heading 1 to be 8 pixels, and from my heading 1 to my body 1 to be also 8 pixels. So I could go ahead and select all of them and press Command or Control G and group these guys. And now I do have a group, and I could potentially increase or decrease that by just dragging on this tiny little line over here. However, this isn't really scalable, as I can't necessarily guarantee the distancing over here. And later on, if I wanted to add something else down here that I also wanted it to be 8 pixels, I have to do that manually like this. And that's just no way to live life. There are easier ways to do this. And one of those easy ways is to just basically create an auto layout out of these. So I'm going to press Command Shift G to ungroup all of these items, and I'm going to select all of them. And in order to create an auto layout, you could either right click and go add auto layout, or you could come over here and while you have all of these guys that you want to include within your auto layout selected, press on the plus over here, or on your keyboard you could just press Shift and A. And I'm just going to use the keyboard shortcut Shift and A to create my auto layouts. So you can see that as soon as I create my auto layout, you can see the layout slightly changes. Nothing's center aligned anymore, and that's for a good reason. This is because the way that auto layouts works, it actually mimics how Flexboxes work in a web environment. So what do I mean by that? I'm going to go Command Z just to go back and show you guys what happens once I click on this auto layout over here. So You can see that my auto layout interface has changed to this kind of, I guess, confusing UI at first. But let's just go ahead and explain what's happening. I've basically stacked and created a frame out of them, and the frame is in the auto layout form. And you can see that I've got an arrow over here that goes vertical direction or horizontal direction. Basically, each of these guys that are stacked, I could display them differently by just changing the direction that I want them to lay out. So at the moment they're vertically, I could also lay them out horizontally if I wanted them to. There are other things as well. So there is this space between items, which is basically the gap over here. At the moment you can see that it's at 8, and I could increase this to be more. I could decrease it to be less. There's also this padding over here. We'll come down to padding a little bit later, padding around items, and I'll explain what that is in just a sec. But let's just go ahead and look at the alignment and padding over here. So you could do individual paddings. Again, we'll come back to padding in a second, but let me just show you guys what alignment means. Basically what alignment means is that you can see that how I've got them displayed in a vertical direction. I can say where I want these items to be aligned to. So I could say that I want them to be aligned to the center, which means that all of my items are now aligned to the center of each other, or everything to the right or everything to the left, which is by default. From the design that I was creating, I want these guys to be aligned to the center like this. Next, I want to explore something else. Let's just go ahead and copy these guys. So I'm just going to hold down my Alt or Option key and just click and drag to create a copy of this. And I want this to be auto layout, but horizontally spaced out. But if I was to click on this, you can see that we get this bounding area that's highlighted by the blue outline. But then you could see that if I was to go ahead and select some of these items, like for example, my sign up, the bounding box around my sign up is much smaller than what you can see from the overall box. The bounding box basically indicates the amount of space available for all of my items. And what I can now do is by aligning the items to the top or to the bottom, I can actually control where these items end up, which gives me a lot of flexibility within my designs as well. We're going to go through auto layout in a future video, a lot more in depth, but I just want to show you guys the absolute basics within this video, and then we could build up on that later on. We have the auto layout for these guys. That's just basically in its simplest form. And going back to the design that I wanted to achieve, I wanted a spacing of 8 between these guys, but I also want these guys to have a total width as well. At the moment, you can see that the width is actually grayed out, but if I was to just click over here and drag it, you can see that I can modify the width now. So let's go ahead and explain what's going on over here. I want a total width of 392 pixels. So I'm going to change this to 392. But what I also want to happen is for each of these bounding boxes over here to basically take as much space as they have available to them automatically. The way to do that is if I was to click over here, you can see that at the moment, this bounding box hugs the content. So it only takes as much space as it needs. But I could basically change that behavior by coming over here and changing this to fill container. The container is a blue bounding box that's represented with the dotted lines right now. And if I was to just simply click on fill container, you can see that now this is fill in the container. I'm going to change all of these to fill container. And you can see that the bounding box for all of these guys is now the full width of the container. Next, I'm going to create another auto layout between this and this because I want the space over here to be exactly 24. So I'm going to push these guys close to each other to get that 24 pixels spacing. And I'm going to select both. And I'm going to press Shift A on my keyboard. Let's also rename these. So I'm going to call these guys heading. And I'm going to call these guys the break line. And now we have the top section of our sign up form ready. Next, I want to create reusable components that I could just drag and drop over here. So let's go ahead and create these reusable components in our component page. So let's go over here. I'm going to paste these guys here. We already have a label. We already have the basic shape of our input box as well. And all I'm going to do is to just select these two guys. I'm going to hold down Shift and press A to create my auto layout. And I'm going to rename this to input. And I want a bunch of different behaviors within here. So the first thing that I want to do is for my label to take as much space as is available to it. So I'm going to change this to fill container. And you can see that as I increase the size of my container, my label grows with that. And I want the same thing to happen to my input down here. So I'm going to rename this to input as well. Let's just go ahead and change the behavior of this from fixed width to fill container. And now you can see that I have this responsive item that I can resize quite easily. My input box is basically ready. So all I'm going to do is to click on create component, go back to my main, go to the assets, look for input. And just like that, I now have all of my input boxes ready to go. So I'm going to change this to first name. I'm going to create another one and I'm going to change this to last name. And I'm going to create the rest as well. So I need an email address and I'll need a password field. But I also want my width to be dynamic. And the way to do that is I want these two guys to be their own layout so that I can control the spacing between them over here. So I'm going to select both of these and I'm going to put them inside the layout. Let's call these one name. So the layout name includes my first and last name components. Let's change this to heading container, just so that everything's organized. And next, I'm going to place this underneath here, make sure that it's at 24 pixels spacing to the top because I'm keeping all of my spacings at 24. You can see that the 24 spacing is over here as well. And I'm going to move this up here at 24 and I'm going to select everything and create these into an auto layout. And I'm just going to rename this to form inputs. Now we learned that previously by changing the width of these guys from fixed width to fill container, it's just going to fill its width to be the size of the container itself. And I'm going to do that for both my email address and password. And you can see that I have this very dynamic container over here that's very flexible and easy to change. Now, one thing that I could do, because I have a heading container over here, which I'm just going to rename to container now, it has a rule of creating a 24 pixel gap between each of these elements, its elements being the top and the bottom elements over here. And I want the same rule between these two. So technically speaking, I could go ahead and drag this and drop it right in here. It creates that 24 pixel gap between these guys. And I could simply, by just pressing the down arrow key on my keyboard, I can move items within a container around. And it's really, really easy to do that. You could see that it's almost like magic. I could basically move these guys around the containing area quite simply like that. The only other item that I need that I don't currently have is a button. In order to create a button, we need to understand the concept of paddings. So what is a padding? I haven't spoken about paddings before, and it's a really well-known factor in a web development world. And it's something that it would be really helpful to learn as a designer as well. Before we create our button, I'm going to create a button typography type. I'm going to just type in button type. What I like to do, I want this to be 14 and 24 in height. So I'm not really going to touch that, but I do want the weight to be bold. So I'm going to change the weight to bold. And I also want the case to be uppercase like this. The rest I'm just going to keep as it is. And I'm going to create button. Let's just call this medium over here. So perfect. Now that button is a part of my type as well. Next, I'm going to create a simple button out of this. There are a couple of different ways to go about this. I mean, I could simply just draw a rectangle like this and place a button on top of it and group them. And, you know, technically I have my button, and later on I could just basically retype whatever that I need within here, adjust the width. But that's just a lot of effort in order to modify this button later. So instead of doing that, I'm going to get rid of the rectangle and let's just change this to sign in. Well, actually, no, we're going to go create account. This is our create account button. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to make this single text into an auto layout. And I could do this by just pressing Shift A on it. And now you can see that we have this bounding box and this is now an auto layout. I don't really need a spacing between anything, so I'm going to make this 0. I'm going to keep its direction as horizontal, but you can see that we got this padding thing over here. So let's go ahead and explain what padding is. Padding is basically the space that you have from your actual element to its bounding box from the outside of it. So you can see that the padding over here is represented at an equal padding on all 4 sides at 8 pixels. And if I was to click on my text text and hold down Alt or Option and hover over the outer boundary, I can see this 8 pixel padding all around. And I could change this, right? So let me just give this a background color. So you could easily give your other layouts background colors by just coming to fill and clicking on this plus. And let's just change this to a primary red for now, just so that we can see what's going on. So you can see that we've got this, actually, I might change this to, we are going to introduce a second primary color very soon. So let's go ahead and do that. So instead of the primary red, let's go ahead and change this to 35A78B. And I'm just going to call this primary teal. This is our primary teal color. You can see that it now exists within my primary world of colors. The other thing that I want to do is to move my primary colors to be represented above the secondary ones. This way, when I'm about to change them over here, you can see that secondary appears first, primary second, but I want that to change. So I could very simply grab primary, move it above secondary. And if I go back over here, you can see that primary now appears first. You could even do that within your colors. So if I wanted teal to appear before red, you could simply do that as well. If I go back to my typography, there's an 8 pixel padding around it. And if I increase this padding, you can see that it equally goes up to like 32 on all sides. The other thing you could do is to control the padding individually on each side. So for example, for me, I want my button to have a total height of 48 pixels. Now, how do I do that? I know that I have a text that has a 24 pixels of a total height. So I need another 24 pixels above and under it, and 24 divided by 2 is 12. So I need a 12 on top, 12 at the bottom, and now I have a 48 pixel total height. I also want my button to have the same border radius as these guys, which is 4 pixels, and I could easily change that right over here. I want my button text to have a neutral color of white. I have that all ready to go. The last thing that I want to do is, at the moment, we have a fixed width, and you could see that I could basically grow my button, but my text over here stays to the left. So I have two options over here. I could basically create a default padding on each side, which I want that default padding on each side to be 16 pixels rather than 32. So I'm going to change this to 16 and 16. But I want the content within here to be centered across everything. And that's where I could just come over here and select the center. And now I have my button right in the center of everything over here. Next, I'm going to have a spacing of 32 between this and this, but at the moment my spacing is 24, so I need to create another auto layout between these two guys. So I'm going to simply select this, select my container, hold down Shift, press A. Now I just created another auto layout, and I'm just going to name this form, and I'm going to change my button to a button. Actually, you know what? Before we do that, let's copy this button, go to components, paste it over here, change its width to hug content. Hug content means that I now have this dynamic button. So as I type in over here, you can see the width of my button changes, but I don't really need a dynamic button for this specific design. I need a button that grows with my form. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to name this to a button. And now I'm going to create a component out of this. Perfect. So let's go back to the main, search for button, drag and drop a button over here, delete create account. Now we have a componentized button, which we are going to name to create account, just like that. And the next thing that I'm going to do, instead of its resizing behavior to be on hug content, I'm going to change this to fill container. And the next thing that I want to do, at the moment, the spacing between this container and this button container is 21. I want that to be 32. And just like that, I have my form container. The next couple of things are quite easy. I basically just need my fine print, which I'm going to add right over here. And my fine print is basically going to say I have read and agreed to the terms of service. I don't want it to be a button medium, but it's going to take its own behavior at 12 and 16. I'm going to remove all the case sensitive elements from here. 12, 16 is fine. I'm going to change all the blacks to black, and I'm going to change the terms of service to the primary and teal by just hovering over it and changing the color there. And I'll just align it over here, and I want this to be at around a 16 pixels of spacing. And I'm just going to select everything, hold down Shift, press A. I'm going to make sure that everything is center aligned, and I will call this form container. And within my form container, I can now create my form background as well. Exactly how we created our button background, by simply giving it a fill, I want the fill to be white, and I want the fill to have a padding. And the padding is going to be top and bottom at 40 pixels, left and right at 52 pixels. And it's going to have a 4 pixels border radius. And I'm going to center this to the center of the page, make sure that it's exactly 32 pixels from the top. I'm also going to copy and paste this underneath over here and change this to already have an account, sign in, and select that bit of a text and change that to the primary color, center this to the page, and the spacing between these two guys, I want them to be at 24 pixels. Okay, we're almost done. We just have to add a couple of more things over here. One of them is going to be the box shadow, and it's quite easy to add drop shadows within Figma. You basically just select your box, you go down to effects, add an effect, make sure it's on drop shadow. There are other ones in here, but you want to make sure that you're on drop shadow. And the properties of my drop shadow is we have an X value of 0, we have a Y value of 4, we have a blur value of 48, we have a drop shadow color of 9B907F, and we have an opacity of 10%. So it's a very, very subtle shadow. So we're almost there. The last two things that I want to do is within the file that I provided for you guys, you could grab those and you could basically drag and drop them within here. So for me, I've placed them inside my documents folder within a folder called website images. And you guys have access to this from the links down below, right below the like button. You could grab them from there. For now, I'm just going to select everything and drag and drop them into my Figma file. There are other ways to bring images into your Figma file. That's just how I do it. But other ways would be to go up to here, go to File, click on Images, or just press on Shift, Command, and K, and you could import images that way as well. Let's just go ahead and put these aside for now. The first image that I want to use is the background sign up. I'm just going to press Command X on my keyboard, click on my frame, and just go Command V. I'm going to center it to the center of the page, like this. But you can see that it's at the top of the layers. I could very simply just press the left bracket on my keyboard and it's just going to send it to the back. Or you could right click and click on send to back. And the next thing that I would like to add is my sign up illustration. So I'm going to again go Command X, Command V, and I'm going to turn on my guides by pressing Control G. And I want my illustration to be at the very, very bottom of the page, right over here at about 8 pixels to the bottom. And we can turn the guides off. So that's it for the sign up. The sign in would be really, really easy. So all I'm going to do is just basically copy this and remove a bunch of items, and we've got our sign in as well. So I'm going to select my sign up. I'm going to hold down Command and press D. That basically duplicates my frame. I'm going to rename it by double clicking up here and change this to sign in. And I'm just simply going to remove the stuff that I don't need. And this is the real power of dynamic auto layouts. I could very simply just double click until I get to my name container and delete that by just pressing the backspace on my keyboard. You could see that the entire form just resized itself. I could change this to sign in. I no longer need this, so I could rename this to forgot your password. Move this one up further, back to the 16 pixels. I believe it was 16. No, it was 24, sorry. I can move this back up to 24 pixels. Change it to don't have an account yet. Create one and change the color. And we could just change these very quickly as well. So changes to sign in, changes to welcome back, sign in to access your account. Make sure that this is centered, and I think this might not be centered. This one is centered, so we're fine there. Make sure that this is center aligned over here, actually. That would help. I'm going to change this to center aligned as well. Get rid of this illustration and get rid of this illustration and bring the right illustrations in. So again, I'm going to Command X, Command V, make sure that it's aligned to the center of my page, left bracket on my keyboard to send it all the way to the back, and then add this guy right in there. Command V, and I want this to be around the same spacing as this guy, which is 8 pixels from the bottom. All right, that's it. That's really it. So you could see that once you set everything up within Figma, it's really, really simple to just replicate the same page and just reuse all of your components. And since I have all of my components based over here as well, I could simply just change anything that I need to. Like in the future, I could potentially change the color of this to red. And if I go back to my design, you can see that all of these guys are all of a sudden red. I'm just going to go Command Z to undo that and go back to my main. Now, the last piece, which is the bonus part, is going to be all about creating a very quick prototype. Creating clickable prototypes within Figma is really simple. Again, we're going to create a deep dive for prototypes later on, but for now, let's just create a very, very simple one. In order to create a prototype within Figma, you simply click on prototype. We're not really going to dive deep into what everything means over here, but for now, let's just create a very simple prototype. So I want this to be a clickable area, so I can click on it. You could see that as you click on things, this little circle appears over here. The circle is basically a way for me to create connections between the frames that I want to jump into or interact with. So I'm going to click and drag to the next frame. So I'm clicking from here and dragging it to sign in. And on click, I simply just want to navigate to sign in. And I just want this to be instant. Yes, that's fine. And once I get there, once I click on this, I want to be able to jump back over here. And just like that, I basically have a prototype. I could rename the flow to just sign in and sign up flow. And if I go ahead and press play, you can see that my prototype appears over here with all of its glory. And I could click on sign in. It's going to jump me to the sign in page, and I could click on sign up and it's going to jump me to the sign up page. There are also other controls as well. Like for example, I could change the background color over here to be with the eyedropper tool to be the same color as the background. And this is a more realistic representation of this on bigger monitors. So if I go back over here, you can see that I get that update immediately. And just like that, you get a very simple prototype ready to go. And you could share this prototype with whoever that you want as well and get feedback or even present it. All right, so that's it for the very basic introduction to Figma. I hope that you guys liked it. In the next couple of videos, I'm going to show you guys how this could be built within HTML and CSS, just so that you guys can get an understanding of design all the way through to development when you work on different projects like this. All right, that's most things that you need in order to get started with Figma. From here, I would probably jump onto a website like Dribbble and grab a bunch of different designs that you like and try to replicate them, or even try replicating a few different of your favorite websites that you've seen. Basically, replicate as many things as possible in order to get to know Figma a little bit better and master your craft. Every time you get stuck, try to Google your solutions and try to get involved within the Figma community, and there's always something out there to answer most of your problems. If you have any questions though, just comment them down below and I'll try to get back to you as fast as I can. I'm also going to make more Figma videos in the near future, so come back to this channel and check for more tutorials. Thanks for watching this. If you have any questions, just leave a comment down below and I'll try to get back to you as fast as I can. If you like this video, please like, subscribe, and share, as all of those actions will help me out greatly. And I'll see you guys in the next one.